what I want to do is show from history God's hand at work. Because I've always felt that if God is working with the nations, as we believe that he is, then surely you should be able to examine history, past history, and see evidence of God's actions. Well, I believe, and I hope to show you tonight, that you can. And it's miraculous. If you read scriptures in the Bible, like in Exodus, where it talks about God parting the waters, and you think of the benefits and his love for the people in those scriptures, then you will be amazed at what we learn about Cromwell tonight. And the way that God puts certain things into processes and certain things into his life and things that surrounded him that affected directly his people, the Jews. God says this about the Jewish people, and we've just read it in Isaiah 43, that they are his witnesses. And what this means to us, that if we look at the Jews and examine what has happened to the Jews, we will see God at work in the world. And when you do, we will see some striking things. Cromwell. Come back with me to the 1600s. That was the time of Cromwell in this country. You'll be surprised, actually, how important this country is going to come up in this subject tonight. At this time, the Jews were dispersed mostly in Eastern Europe, places like Poland and the Ukraine, Lithuania. And they were quite settled there, as they were citizens in the sense we are citizens. They had very little rights and they had persecution. But on the whole, for Jews, they were quite settled. But unbeknown to them, God is about to perform a miracle in England that would change their lives and ultimately culminate in their descendants returning to Israel. And that's why we've chosen Cromwell to start with, because I'm going to propose to you, and you can go along with me or not, that this is one of the turning points for the return of the Jews to Israel in 1948. Because this was God's ultimate aim. In Jeremiah it says, "Hear the word of the Lord, O nations, proclaim it in a distant coastland. He who scattered Israel will gather them and will watch over his flock. For I will take you out of the nations. I will gather you from all countries and bring you back into your land." And all this, although this process started pretty much as soon as they were cast out of the land, this time, the 1600s, is pivotal to their history, and we can see God's hand at work. Well, at least I suggest that. Okay, I'm sorry, but there's a bit of history, so if I go across stuff you already know, fine, and if it gets boring, I'm sorry, I'll try not to make it boring. 350 years before the 1600s, where we all are at the moment, the Jews have been expelled by Edward I, and they had never been allowed back into England. But, as we will see, God needed the Jewish people to be back in England. So he caused something to happen. And you're probably aware of what he caused to happen, but you may not have seen it in this light. He caused something to happen. Remember, up to this point, England had a royal heritage from many hundreds of years before, back to the BC, whatever it was, not BC, AD 600. Was it 600, 800? Sounds about right. We'd always had a royal line. And we have a queen today, don't we? We all have a royal line today. But then Cromwell came along, and the Puritans. Cromwell became a member of Parliament in 1628. And he belonged to a group that had an agenda of godly reformation. This is important. There was no intention at this point in Cromwell's mind of overthrowing the crown. Cromwell was a pro-Jewish Puritan who believed that the second coming of Jesus could not happen until the scattering of the Jews to the end of the earth was complete. The Puritans believed that because the Jews were not in every country. They hadn't been scattered completely. Therefore, the return of Jesus could not happen. Okay, interesting. Fine. But he's a parliamentarian, no intention of overthrowing the crown whatsoever. Until in 1969, and you're aware of this, 1969 is a good year. 1649, I'm not going to go into the whole of the history. Cromwell was at the head of a government that beheaded a British king. It is the first time that this royal line has been broken, that England is no longer ruled by a king. That in itself is probably not striking. I mean, it's striking to me, but it's then what happens next. So the Puritans are effectively in control. That's useful. But that's not going to send the Jews to England. And I've already stated that God needs the Jews in England, and you'll see why in a minute. That's not going to get the Jews into England, is it? Although it does help, because the royals, as we saw, had apparently banned the Jews from coming from England. And had Charles I still got his head, he would have maintained that. But something else happened, or I suggest God made something else happen in Europe at exactly this time. In 1648, Bogdan Chmielnicki led a Cossack revolt in the Ukraine against the gentry. It's not dissimilar to the revolt in Russia at the turn of the 20th century, the start of the 20th century. He defeated the Polish army, and then, as they did in Russia, they turned on the Jews, slaughtering 100,000 of them. It was the worst pogrom they had suffered for nearly 400 years, the Jews. And what's the effect? What effect did this have? Well, they had to flee towards Germany and Holland. But Germany and Holland didn't want them. And exactly at this time, and they never expected to be able to get into England, but because of this tiny window of history, and it is really tiny, you'll be amazed in a minute, I hope, because of this tiny window of the Puritans coming to power, being pro-Jewish and believing that the Jews should be in England, the Jews were allowed to pass into Germany, and from Holland, Amsterdam, they migrated for the first time ever to this country. The 12-year window. This is how tight it is. The law stopping the Jews from coming to England turned out actually never to have existed. It was an act of royal prerogative. That means the king had said he didn't want the Jews in, therefore they didn't come in. But it wasn't a law, it wasn't on the statute books, which was perfect, because there was no law, so it did not need repealing. The government didn't need to go and repeal a law so that the Jews could come in. They were pro-Jewish, they came in, and also because they didn't have to repeal a law, or because they didn't have to make a new law, when Charles II came to power, there was nothing he could repeal. It's beautiful. I'm sorry if the information is sparse, but obviously I've got to move on. But if you want to talk to me about it afterwards. And all this happened. Now this is, maybe I'm pushing a point here, but you'll have to decide on this yourself. All this happened in 12 years. Cromwell was in power, or there was no king after the beheading of Charles I, till Charles II was a 12-year window. Okay? Bear that in mind, because we're going to come back to that 12-year window. And I've put a little note down at the bottom. God held back the British monarchy like the waters of the Red Sea, just for a short time, and then he left orders to be restored. And as I say, we have a queen today. Okay. But why is this important? Well, why is it important that the Jews came to England? Firstly, for the first time since the Roman Empire, the Jews were allowed full citizenship. They'd never had it in any other country in Europe until they came to England. But most importantly, in 1654, the British took New York. All at the same time, they took New York and eventually America from the Dutch and the French. So we can see what I'm suggesting God is doing. The Jews can get into England. They can now get across to America. And that is going to become a vital part of the jigsaw when we come to the Jews going back to Israel in 1948, as we will see. Okay. It's also important because it established the Jews in this country. Had we kept the Jews out, they would have got here eventually, obviously, but we wouldn't have had a Jewish prime minister, Israeli. And also, importantly, the dying British Empire that controlled Palestine, which is now Israel, after the First World War. That's not very well written, is it? You can tell I typed this out. Thus offering one of the biggest single keys to the Jews' return, the Balfour Declaration. Because the Jews were in England and very well accepted in this country, around the time after the First World War, the British Empire now controlled Palestine. Because they controlled it, they agreed, via Balfour and Wiseman and various other people, to allow the Jews to set up a nation there. Okay. So these are the reasons why it's important of this 12-year window. Right, moving on. Am I going too fast, too slow? Okay. Anybody want to ask a question? No? You're allowed to speak to me as well, if you wish. Okay. So I'm suggesting, before we move on to Hitler, that Cromwell shows us this miraculous gap in history where God took things and changed them about so that the Jews have this opportunity to come to England, go to America, and we will see that will affect their future history, as we've already hinted. There's a second 12-year window, and I've always found this odd about the Nazis, that they rose so quickly and were destroyed so quickly. So they came up, they had 12 years of power. All that devastation they caused was all achieved in just 12 years. That is not 1946, it's 45, I'm sure you all know. 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. That's when he rose to power. 12 years later, in 1945, the Nazi Party no longer existed. I don't need to tell you the history. I'm sure you're aware of the history of the Second World War. But the odd thing about Germany, the real strange thing, is that before the First World War, Germany had been the most desired country for a Jew to exist in. They were assimilating in a way that's not seen. What do I mean by that? They were stopping becoming Jews. There's a saying from before the First World War, we are Germans before we're Jews. And this started in Germany and was most pronounced in Germany before the First World War. The Jews were a respected part of German society, and that actually was starting to spread out into Austria, Holland, not quite as far as Spain, but it was starting to spread. They were assimilating and they were losing their Jewishness. But that all changed. The First World War devastated Germany, as it did the whole of Europe. And Hitler decided that the criminals of the case were the Jews and they needed punishing. But, and this is the odd thing about the 12-year gap of Nazism, don't get me wrong, it caused great devastation, as we know, from the Holocaust and many other ways. But there were certain facts about Nazi power that are not often stated. In the early 1930s, the Nazis actively assisted the emigration of German Jews to Palestine. Of course they did. They wanted to get a way of getting them out of the country. So they gave them passage. 60,000 Germans were sent to Palestine. But not only that, they were allowed to take their money, they were allowed to take their wealth, and the industry and the infrastructure of the early settlements pre-Second World War in Israel was built on German money, surprisingly, and American money, but German money as well. Also, the war saw the most capable fighters from Germany flee to Palestine, leaving the European Jews undefended. This wasn't just from Germany, this was from Poland as well. Begin was a Prime Minister of Israel, yes? He escaped Russia and to go out to fight to Israel. Well, a lot of their best fighters went to Israel to defend what they call Erev Israel. Okay, so because of the Nazis, the Jews are pushed over to Israel in good numbers with money, and they are amassing a small army over there to defend the country, although unfortunately the European Jews were left undefended. And after the war, the destruction of the European Jewry for a very short while softened the hearts of the nations, and Israel was allowed to form a state. And this is one of the keys to understanding the Holocaust, and only one of the keys. It's a difficult subject. Because after the war, when the camps were opened, the nations were more willing to give the Jews what they desired, the homeland in Israel, than at any other point. But it was a close thing. And here is another view of the hand of God controlling things, controlling matters in the history and the minds of men. I often think of Pharaoh when I look at this, because how God kept hardening his heart. One fact that is not well known is about, well, I say not well known, Roosevelt, you may be aware of this, is that Roosevelt supported the Jews before the war. Actually, he got into power on the ticket, because in this time, in America, there are a good percentage of Jews, and they're very powerful. That's one of the reasons they had to go to America. But by the end of the war, Roosevelt had changed his mind. He did not think, he was cooling at the idea of a national home for the Jews. He was not going to support it. David Niles wrote, he was a US presidential assistant, there is serious doubt that Israel would have come into being had Roosevelt lived. Roosevelt didn't live. He died, and he was replaced by Harry S. Truman. He was profoundly affected by the Holocaust and the plight of the Palestinian Jews, and, more importantly, unlike Roosevelt, he needed the Jewish vote. So Truman was very much so for the Jews having a homeland in Israel. A very small point, but had Roosevelt not died at that time, because this window we're talking about is this small. It's not 12 years, it's less than a year. But what about Stalin? Now, I'm sure you're aware of the Russian attitude to the Jews, certainly after the revolution of 1917. The Jews supported the revolution of 1917. Actually, one of Hitler's arguments was that they were behind the revolution of the Russian Revolution in 1917, and he's probably not far off. But after Trotsky's death, he was a Jew, by the way, the Russians turned against the Jews. And by the time of Stalin, they were back to being persecuted in Russia. Second-class citizens again. But then something very strange happened to Stalin, almost unexplainable. In 1944, at the end of the war, against character and against Russian policy, this is, because in Russia they were still second class, he adopted a pro-Zionist posture in foreign policy. It seems that he liked the idea of a socialist Zionist state which would decline British influence in the Middle East. So he thought, if I can support the Zionists in Israel, then it'll get the British out of there and decrease their empire. 1944. He thought like this for a very short period of time. In May 1947, Russia shocked the UN by voting in favour of Israel state. They were expected to vote against it. And in May 1948, This is the month when the state of Israel became, the independence of Israel became into being. 3 days after the independence was declared, Stalin gave it its full recognition and even instructed the Czech government to sell its arms. It was like, to the world then, as if it was in a state of lunacy. It was not expected of this man. Before this period and after this period, he never did anything like it. Within months, the normally anti-Semitic Stalin seemed to wake up and out of a stupor return to his intensely anti-Semitic phase of his policy. But by then it was too late. It was months after the State of Israel was formed that he seemed to, he changed his stance. He had a Jewish actor murdered, and then everything changed. But it was too late. But the window was that small within a year. Had Roosevelt not died, had Stalin not for some odd reason changed his mind and had this romantic idea about, a communist state in Israel, then those two powerful nations very probably would have blocked the idea of an independent Jewish state, although they would have supported the Jews in the land, probably, but they wouldn't have had an independent Jewish state, most likely. So that's it. 1948, 14th of May, a date Ken knows very well because it's his birthday. Israeli independence was born. But why did we start with Cromwell? Why was I so excited about this 12-year gap that just opened up in British history for no apparent reason, it seems? Why was I so excited about the Jews going to America? Because the Jews went to America, because it was a free state, they became extremely successful. Of per capita, of the most wealthy people in America, they still are. And because of that, there was the financial support to support the new fledgling Jewish nation. Had the Jews not been prominent in America, there simply would not have been the financial means for the state of Israel to exist. It is probably one of the most blatant facts of history that they could not have done it without the support of the American Jews. And they wouldn't have had the support of the Polish Jews if they'd survived. They had no money. They were poor. European Jews have always, well, on the whole, always been poor. And Isaiah 62 says, "You shall no longer be termed forsaken, nor shall your land any more be termed desolate, but you shall be called Hephzibah. My delight is in her, and your land a Beulah, for the Lord delights in you, and your land shall be married." So we can see, I believe, that God's hand at work through the Jews. 12-year halt in the royal rule allowed the Jews into Britain and then on to America. 12 years of Nazi terror, and it was terrible, and I don't mean to undermine the fact of the atrocities that they had to undergo, but there were positives from it. They aided the Jews back to the land. And for a very short, brief moment, at the time of after the end of the Second World War for Stalin, he was favourable to the Jews, and it really was a small time. Do you see God's hand in this? Well, I obviously do. And then in conclusion then, "Thus saith the Lord of hosts, people shall yet come, inhabitants of many cities. The inhabitants of one city shall go to another, saying, let us continue to go and pray before the Lord and seek the Lord of hosts. Yes, many people and strong nations shall come and seek the Lord of hosts in Jerusalem and pray before the Lord. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, in those days 10 men from every language of the nation shall grasp the sleeve of the Jewish man, saying, let us go with you, for we have heard that God is with you." I'll leave you with that. Thank you.